Hey guys, first of all, I just want to apologize because I have a terrible cold. So I am currently recording this lecture from my bed with my hot tea next to me, just kind of hoping for the best. In any event, I have just a few slides to go over for this week with Chapter 3 going for it. They're talking about recruitment and candidacy. How do these people even get to office? They're crazy. But really, the bulk of the chapter is spent on discussing the formal and informal qualifications for both the House and the Senate, which really isn't too complicated, as we know, and I'll go over those shortly. And then we also spend a lot of time on redistricting, apportionment, and gerrymandering, which is pretty important. And I've got some pretty funny clips for you that'll help you understand, as well as an activity. And an extra reading I put for this week because it's really good. It's also a really good read, but it discusses how the Senate's apportionment actually creates an injustice for underserving minority communities. So if you give that a read as well, it'll help you with your quiz this week. So let's just jump right on in. So, like you will see in the chapter, recruitment is going to be the process through which people seek and win leadership posts. And everybody who is currently in Congress, with the exception of people who maybe are called called long shot candidates, when they didn't get party support and then they just kind of had a weird upset victory. Are the products of recruitment, and generally recruitment happens internally, actually, with Congress, as they will have a committee, a campaign committee, to go out and seek who is good, who is qualified, and who has the informal qualifications to be a member of Congress. They'll support them and help mentor them throughout the campaign process, and also having that endorsement from somebody in Congress is always really, really helpful, specifically because incumbency advantage is one of the highest reasons that somebody can be reelected. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's also formal and informal regulations. So formals are going to be like the laws, regulations, and the constitutional requirements for holding seat in the House and the Senate. And those are pretty easy, right? We know, we talked about them last time, 25, 30 residency requirements and things like that. Informal or informal unwritten rules are going to be things like their ambition. That should actually say skills. I'll fix that before I post this. Their resources, their attitudes, popular culture. So it might be really hard for somebody who is an anti-establishment person running in Congress in a very liberal district. So public attitudes towards Congress would be that. Another thing. Ambitions and skill. Essentially, you're trying to sell yourself to these people, right? So I like to think that they have to have a certain kind of characteristics in order to put yourself kind of out there, live in a fishbowl, have all of your life open for the public to see, and still be able to sell yourself successfully. They generally have to do a lot of interaction one-to-one with people. Let's take Beto O'Rourke, for example. He's almost literally walked across the state of Texas knocking on doors trying to get everybody to swing their vote from the incumbent to him. It's been very successful. But that's a skill that you have to take, and you also, it's not easy, it's a sacrifice, it really is. For a lot of people, they sacrifice their privacy, they sacrifice their ability to earn income. There's a lot of things that are involved when you decide to run that require you be a certain type of person. Resources is another thing. Like I said a minute ago, you have to sacrifice, and they're extremely expensive. So you have to be able to be in a position to where you can either do really intense fundraising, or can just finance your own campaign, or are in the position to where you can live without income for an extended period of time. That's really, really important. It also is one of the biggest reasons why people, average citizens, can't run for Congress, because they can't up and leave their work for, several months on end to campaign. And they can't finance a campaign either. That's a really, really big obstacle that people have to overcome in order to have a successful run for Congress. And is one of the main reasons why people lose, because they don't have the resources to have a successful campaign. All right, moving on here. So, when I mentioned a moment ago, people's attitudes, let me just go back one slide, popular attitudes, we have to try and remember and understand how voters decide who they want to vote for. Usually, people will decide who to vote for, who they want to vote for, based on these three criteria. And so, when I read these two, ask yourself, why, in the last election, why did you vote for the person that you did? Generally, it's because of partisanship, which means that you are, for example, a Democrat and would have never voted for the Republican. It doesn't matter anything else. You're always going to vote for the Democrat, or vice versa. Issues that are relevant. A big one for Hillary Clinton was that she was pro-gun control. Okay, and so people who had strong issues with gun regulations, really that one particular issue really turned them off. They wouldn't vote for anybody who is not pro-Second Amendment. Same thing with like pro-life and pro-choice. Things like that are issues that people decide or make judgments on who they want to elect based on. And the third was great for Obama, candidate characteristics. Their personality, things that they feel they have in common. Clinton also, not Hillary Clinton, but Bill Clinton had a very easy time with characteristics as well, is that people just find them palatable. In the 2016 presidential election, I think a lot of people actually found Donald Trump's lack of political correctness refreshing, and that they were able to connect with him, or they felt that they were not lesser than him. So based on those three things, generally, I've actually never in my experience done a poll in my class and asked students why they voted the way they did, and had somebody who didn't fall within these three. So generally you're going to see partisanship, issues, and then characteristics. Those are the largest things. And all of these things are things that can be measured. Okay, so if you're running, let's say we're running for Texas 23, because we just had Gina Ortiz-Jones on campus. She generally has an understanding already, prior knowledge about her district. All of these things are measurable. She knows that in the last election cycle, her voter turnout rates were one way or the other. She also knows what issues are relevant to her constituency. She can't really do too much about characteristics, but, I mean, she can try and come off as a representative person. But essentially, she has to mitigate people's already existing conceptions, their already existing partisanship, and do something called the median voter theorem, where they adjust their own personal messages or platforms to help fit the median attitudes about government at the time. So she will have to adjust herself to try and win the most votes based on these three things. Here's an example. This is a graph of voters who identified with a party voted for that party's presidential candidate. So, Democrats, 92% of Democrats, let's see if I can get, voted for Obama. 93% of Republicans voted for Romney. And independents were split 50-50. So partisanship is one of the highest reasons that somebody will vote in that way. My mom's an example. She would never, ever, ever vote for a Republican. Doesn't matter if it was a terrible, corrupt, terrible, corrupt politician. But there's a lot of people that are on the opposite side of that. It doesn't matter who the person on the other side is. If they're not part of their party, they won't vote for them. It's a very partisan-driven culture right now. But, incidentally, doing some research, only about 20% of the congressional partisanship is a stem of individual partisanship. So people in Congress aren't being so partisan because their constituencies are necessarily so partisan, or because their districts are so strongly gerrymandered. That's there's a article in your book. Well, he mentions an article that I could actually post because it's relevant. It's very interesting to think that what the root cause of partisanship in Congress is right now. In any event, let's move on. So, aside from that, there are three factors to determine who even gets elected. We know why people vote in the way that they do, but we need to know who gets elected, the person, the type of person that gets elected. These are limited by who runs, incumbency advantage, and apportionment and redistricting. So, we have a self-select system in the United States. You have to decide to run for office. We can't force you, not born into a system in which you have to run for office, although we do have some informal suggestions, like if you're born with the last name Bush or Kennedy, people are kind of going to expect that you do these things. But, again, you have to self-select. I would have loved to have voted for Joe Biden in 2016, but he didn't run. It was the saddest day of my life. That was a joke. You're free to laugh. So, the second one is incumbency advantage. The incumbent is very fortunate because they're able to hold a position in which they've already got an advantage simply because they're in that position. On the next slide, we'll discuss that further, so I'm just going to leave it there as for now. And the third thing is going to be apportionment and redistricting. The way congressional districts are drawn is going to have a large effect on who ended up getting elected in that district, and we spend a lot of time on that as well, so I'm going to just move forward now. Incumbency advantage is a very, very real thing. It nearly almost ensures the re-election rate. So we right now have a 90% re-election rate in Congress, while as an institution they have about a 10% approval rate, and that's generally because incumbency advantage is so strong. They've already had the opportunity to work constituent services, take care of individuals. They probably have been able to do pork barrel spending for their district, and if you guys are unfamiliar with pork barrel spending, it's essentially funds in legislation that are specifically earmarked for that congressman's district. Taxpayer funds coming, federal dollars coming specifically to that district for different projects and so on. But this incumbency advantage is extremely, extremely helpful. It's also helpful when you are recruiting people and you end up getting their endorsement because people feel one way or another about people who are already serving in Congress. It helps with the re-election rate. But it also preserves the status quo. We know that things won't change unless we get people to change them. And we also know that our founding fathers did not intend for congressmen to have term limits. They thought that they would only become better with age and tenure and service. So they intentionally did not put that. Although one of the things that Donald Trump campaigned on, especially later in the election, was the idea of term limits. We'll see how that goes. It seems pretty unlikely that the people who would be required to create a constitutional amendment would limit their own power, but we'll see. Could be something. Maybe you guys can write it and put them on a referendum election. That would make me so proud. Okay, so let's look at apportionment now. Apportionment is going to be the process of dividing all 435 of those seats among the states. And there's Senate and House apportionment. Senate apportionment is pretty easy, right? There are 2 senators per state. But that seems very cut and dry. However, that makes the Senate one of the least democratic branches. So Reynolds v. Sims was the Supreme Court case that established the precedent of one person, one vote, and that does not apply in the Senate, although it only doesn't apply de facto. The intention was to have equality, but equity and equality are not the same thing, okay? So, when you have 2 people from each state, there's going to be a huge discrepancy. Senators from the 26 smallest states represent only 17.8% of the nation's population, but they constitute 52% of the Senate. That's crazy. Crazy overrepresentation. Okay? That means all these people have so much more influence in Congress, in the Senate in particular, than people from very populous states. So the 9 most populous states have 51% of the nation's population, but only 18% of the Senate. So drastic underrepresentation in the Senate. Okay? Here's by way of example. California has 32 million people, and they have the same number of votes in the Senate as Wyoming's 4,800. 480,000. That's the cold talking, guys. Sorry about that. So, the equality in the same voice that populous states have in the Senate is not. They're losing a lot of representation. Another indirect effect is that people, the leaders that are elected, are probably going to come from smaller states rather than larger, because larger states have to appease much larger populations of people, and then smaller states are the only ones that can accommodate that workload. So leadership in the Senate is usually only done from smaller states. Further to this is the book actually just briefly quotes it, but the paper is I've uploaded it to this week's module. It's really worth a read, and it's discussing how the Senate's apportionment has created an inequality among minority populations. I think that's significant, and so I've assigned it for you guys to read this week, and I'll have a little question about it on y'all's quiz. Just a little reflection question, but let's move forward. The House is much more convoluted in terms of apportionment. So Article 1, Section 2 says that apportionment among the states has to be according to their respective numbers. So basically the House is apportioned seats in Congress based on population. We knew that, right? How do they know how many people are in the state? The census. It's extremely reliant upon the census. Every 10 years we go around the country and try and count the people, and it's there's a lot of different methods for counting them, but it's extremely difficult. We also count in the census the people who are Americans living abroad, federal workers who are living abroad, stationed abroad, citizens who are temporarily adjudicated to a different state. All of those are counted. Incidentally, also Native Americans are counted, but they are not considered when we are apportioning the seats. So they'll be counted for total population, but they won't be counted in terms of apportionment. And then, once we've counted the number of citizens, they use the method of equal proportions in determining how the most equitable way to divide up these seats based on that. Let me show you the equation, because I'm a political scientist, not a mathematician. This is extremely hard for me to explain. This is the equal proportions method. I don't understand it. There's letters and stuff, so maybe if you're a math person, you can see, but all of this is very transparent. So you can take a look. This is actually the census's website, because again, apportionment relies heavily on the census, but feel free to take a look at it. This is also really interesting to just kind of go through these historical numbers as well. Alright, let's go back. Oops. So, it seems pretty cut and dry. You know, you count the number of people as best you can, but there's a couple of different problems. One, they have to also count is it the total number of people, or is it the total number of citizens that they're counting? Because there's some states that have a lot of people, but they might not necessarily be American citizens, undocumented citizens. I know that's a point of contention right now, because it might skew the numbers if we add a question asking if the people are actually American citizens or just temporarily residing in the United States. In any event, two more. Each state has to have at least one House member, and congressional districts cannot cross state lines. Okay, so that makes it so districts are not always 100% equal, but they have to get to their best approximation. So a resident whose population just barely qualifies for 2 has almost twice the representative influence as somebody who only has one House seat. So you know, it's not a perfect system. There is a quote by James Madison. Oh, is it James Madison? It might be, I can't remember who was it, but it's, how can we expect perfect laws from imperfect men? So we could do our best, but in any event, they average about 700,000 people, 747,000 people per district. Okay, so there's two regulations that we have to go by when we create districts. So at the same time that we are apportioning these seats, we have to redraw the district lines every 10 years if there has been a change. So there's been a couple of decades that have gone by in which we haven't had to redraw the lines because there hasn't been a dramatic shift in population. But when we do need to redraw the lines, they are in correlation with the census every 10 years, and they are mandated by these two regulations. 1967 statute mandating that all states are entitled to more than one seat create districts that are represented by a single member. So that creates our single member district system. As such, legislators will attempt in the years immediately before and immediately after a census to try and win as many seats as they can so that they can have as much influence as possible when the census drawing board creates new districts, okay? We'll look at that in a minute as to who's the one who draws the districts, but essentially it's either an independent committee or the legislature themselves. And so if there's only one person per district, you've really got to try and maximize your influence or win that district before they start the process. And the second one is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is probably the single-handedly most important piece of legislation to ensure the franchise for underrepresented communities. In 2013, it was, what was it, 2012, 2013, it was amended to remove the pre-clearance section, but currently as it stands, it prohibits racial discrimination in voting practices. That's also a type of requires that prohibits. I'll fix it. And it prohibits gerrymandering based on race, color, or membership of a language minority. Okay, that means that if you don't speak English, that they cannot use that in account while they redraw the lines. Okay, pre-clearance was a procedure that was overturned because they said it didn't have any modern-day significance, and it essentially says that in places that have a history of discriminatory electoral practices have to get federal approval before they're allowed to implement any kind of changes that might impact those populations. Okay, that was overturned immediately after it was overturned. Like the next year, the state of Texas and several other states implemented voter ID laws that required citizens show a specific type of voter ID, either a state-issued driver's license, ID card, or their voter registration card, in order to vote. And that was a discriminatory practice because that means that a whole bunch of people who may not have that kind of card, in particular migrant workers, wouldn't be able to vote. And it also put a pretty big cap on early voting. And that was significant because the group of people that tend to come out and vote early are Democratic. At the time in Texas, it was a Republican stronghold. So, these things clearly do have a modern-day influence. But in any event, they are no longer required to get that pre-clearance. However, because the part of it that says that you cannot discriminate based on color, race, or membership of a language minority, some of that has been struck down. Alright, so let's get into redistricting. Redistricting is done every 10 years after the census, and it can vary between legislatures drawing the new lines, bipartisan committees, nonpartisan independent committees, panels. There's a wide range, but the bulk of the states, it's something like 23 states, use their legislature to redraw the lines. Okay, and in that way, it's really important to maximize your influence in the legislature or your party's influence in the legislature in order to have the most influence in the redrawing process. Most of the time, most districts gerrymandered are done so to support a particular party's interest. And usually, so that's called partisanship gerrymandering. That's usually why people will do it. It's very difficult to prove that a district has been partisan gerrymandered. Essentially trying to maximize that party's influence and minimize the opposing party's influence in that district. That is illegal, but it's very, very difficult to prove. There's something called the efficiency gap that says it's basically an equation to find the difference between each party's quote-unquote wasted votes. That is the number of votes that would have been diluted, divided by the entire district's vote. Again, math is hard, and I don't know how to do it. But it is difficult to prove. That's why we will see a lot of gerrymandered districts existing without the court intervening, because they can't prove it. Malapportionment is different from gerrymandering. This means that they create districts with divergent ratios of voters to representatives. Okay, so here's an example. If a single-member district has 10,000 votes and another has 100,000 votes, voters in the former have 10 times the influence per person. Okay, it's deliberate, usually for favoring equity rather than, again, equality. There's a difference between those two. So, malapportionment, apportioning it unfairly, is different than gerrymandering. Alright, I actually think this is our last slide, guys. We've done it. And I've only had a coughing fit like 3 times. Thanks for sticking with me. So, this clip, y'all should I'll post it, this YouTube clip. Take a look at it. It is hilarious. It's definitely worth your time. But gerrymandering is going to be the practice intended to establish an advantage for one party over another by manipulating boundaries. Excuse me. And there's 3 ways in which this can be done. The most popular is packing. Packing, ramming people, or really packing them together in one district, voters of one party in a district, to dilute their votes in another district. Essentially minimize their influence in Congress. If you can pack all of the Latino population into one district, you're only going to have one person in Congress representing that group, and the rest of them will be represented by other groups that might be more sympathetic to the political party that's in power's cause. Okay? For instance, African American populations that are in urban areas tend to vote for Democrats. If we're living in Texas, if we can pack all of that demographic together, we'll only have one representative advocating for their constituency in our legislature. Okay? And that doesn't constitute a minority. But if we crack them, or if we had them normally without gerrymander, they might make up a majority of more than one party. Okay? The second one is cracking or tearing away those dense pockets of voters to dilute them. So if you wanted none, you can make it so you take that one particular pocket or packed district and break it up into several other districts so that it dilutes the vote, and there'll be a minority in several districts, thereby ensuring that there won't be any representation in Congress. Stacking is one that's very rare. It's also very controversial, but it's when you merge 2 districts together and force the incumbents to run against each other so that they have to kick one out. And usually this is done for somebody who's very unpopular and they're trying to kick somebody out. It's much harder to do because, again, the incumbents both have an influence in Congress while they're redrawing the lines, so they can see it happening. They can stop it beforehand. I have examples. District 4, Illinois, is considered the most gerrymandered district. It's right here. Let me get my little pen out for y'all. So, you can see here, Illinois Congressional District 4. This is they're packing minority Puerto Ricans, most Hispanic cultures, Latin Americans, into this one district, and you could see barely here. Technically, it is congruent. It's touching because this small narrow strip of the highway system connects these the north with the south. And yeah, what they're doing is packing all of that one demographic in to minimize their influence in Congress. This is the original right here. Gerrymanderer, like a salamander. This is the newspaper when the article came out. That's like the first time that somebody has done that. This is North Carolina Congressional District 12. Woo! That one is gerrymandered. This is especially interesting because the Court of Appeals recently looked at North Carolina's districts and declared that they are indeed partisan gerrymandered, meaning that they've been redrawn to put one party at an advantage over another, in particular the Republican Party to the advantage of the Democratic Party. And they forced them to redraw the lines. But that's significant because right now, in less than 2 months, we have a very large midterm election season, and so there's people running for districts that may not exist or may need to be redrawn. So we'll see how that goes. I imagine it's an extremely difficult thing to do. But I'm sure they can get it done. So that's it. Guys, we did it. Thank you so much for bearing with my scratchy voice. If y'all have questions about gerrymandering or the recruitment process, please feel free to email me. My daughter is also sick, so I may not be in my office hours as scheduled, but send me an email, and if you need to meet with me during office hours, I'll be sure to be there. Just let me know you're coming. I've only heard from like 2 of y'all regarding your member profiles. I put an announcement up on Blackboard that has an assignment description guide for y'all, so you know what I'm looking for. Please start looking at that, and if you have questions about that, feel free to email me as well. Thanks, guys. I'll see ya.